Chapter 36. The Crown Prince privately strolled through the palace and found himself crossing a familiar bridge to the foreign pavilion. His steps became less confident and hesitant, yet he was curious to see how much the pavilion had changed. To his surprise, the secluded area was brimming with the most exotic flowers. The bright petals were in full bloom, and the spring air gently tickled his nose. The garden seemed to have flourished greatly during his absence. He caught sight of a shimmering figure leaning against a slender pillar, basking underneath the sun. Because it was still early in the afternoon, the sun seemed to shine down on Celine's skin and glisten. Prince Leith momentarily froze, blinded by the beautiful woman in her sleep. She resembled a sparkling, otherworldly being. Celine had frequently paid visits to the Crown Prince the past few weeks, which sparked countless rumors amongst the nobles. Only a select few knew the truth of those rumors. She only came by to oversee his work, advising him with helpful suggestions. If one observed the dynamic between the two, they would immediately notice the slight discomfort in Celine's eyes. Every conversation between them was strictly centered around the Zaynits, and Celine never bothered to initiate a meaningful conversation with him. Her expression never softened around Prince Leith, as if she had drawn a clear, invisible line between them. As Celine heard the sound of footsteps growing louder, she opened her eyes and stiffened when she saw Prince Leith's golden eyes. "I guess you were expecting someone else." He towered over her, his shadow giving Celine some shade from the sun. He gave her an awkward smile, for the dismay was clearly written all over her face. I was. Celine had been eagerly waiting for Prince Zayden to finish his lessons, for they had planned to visit the remote desert soon after. She had been expecting to see Zayden's familiar face when she was met with Prince Leith's towering figure instead. Celine looked away, not wanting to see the Crown Prince's beautiful appearance. Recently she had been meeting with Prince Leith quite often, forcing herself to feign indifference when facing his seemingly perfect features. He was truly the most handsome man Celine had ever laid eyes on in her 2 lifetimes, and even she couldn't stop herself from blushing subconsciously. Celine was ashamed of herself for not being able to control her cheeks from reddening. This fact annoyed her greatly, and she was growing tired of his presence. "Your Highness, may I say something?" she suddenly asked. Prince Leith became excited by her sudden interest in him and nodded quickly. "Now that we have formed a plan and set it in motion, I don't think I need to visit you anymore. You seem to be progressing well anyways. I don't want Lady Zavia to feel jealous or hurt because of me, and I also don't want to cause any more misunderstandings. Therefore, let's not run into each other like this." She closely observed his reaction, wondering if her words had offended the prince. "Seriously, why are you even here?" Her eyes flickered with slight annoyance, as if his mere presence was troublesome. The smile on Leith's lips faltered. He frowned as if he had been wronged. "How come you are rude to me?" Celine, his tone darkened slightly, yet there was a hint of despair in his tone. Celine couldn't believe her ears. Was this man serious? "If anything, I think your Highness was rude first. Although we hadn't seen each other for 7 years, you returned with a concubine, and even treated me harshly. Weren't we good friends in the past?" She gave him an unfaltering stare, and his attractiveness seemed to be less intimidating now. "That's because," Prince Leith faltered again, unable to voice his reasonings out loud. He frowned deeply, furrowing his eyebrows as he became conflicted. "I treated you harshly," because he stuttered, and Celine raised an eyebrow, urging him to continue. Before Prince Leith could properly reply, Prince Zayden interrupted their conversation. "Sorry I'm late." Celine, he sharply glared at his own brother and nodded briefly, paying no more attention to him. Meanwhile, Celine immediately brightened and the tense atmosphere slightly dispelled. "You're not too late. How was your lesson?" She took Zayden's outstretched hand and stood up, wiping the dirt off her gown. The two became immersed in their own conversation, completely leaving Leith out of the loop. He coughed deliberately in an attempt to gather their attention again, and Celine only glanced sideways. "I deeply apologize, Your Highness, but I will be taking my leave now." She lowered her head and curtsied. "I'll see you later." Brother Zayden nodded politely, and they both strode past Leith, continuing their conversation. The Crown Prince blushed in embarrassment, clenching his fist as the two blatantly disregarded him. He was deeply flustered, ridiculed by their rudeness. When he had finally recovered from the shock, his fiancé and brother had already left. Celine giggled on their way to the town. "Did you see your brother's face?" He didn't know how to act. She threw her head back and laughed, recalling his frustration. Zayden did not reply, although his lips were curved upwards as he led her to the outskirts of the capital. They headed towards an isolated field filled with sand dunes. Zayden and Celine frequently trained with their familiars in this abandoned desert. If there were any travelers or merchants passing by, they wouldn't be able to see their figures due to the force of Draco and Red's wings, creating the illusion of a sandstorm. This was why Celine and Zayden also traveled with a cloth covering everything but their eyes. Even after living in the Middle East for 16 years, Celine still couldn't get used to the endless hills smoothly sculpted by the winds. The sands gleamed under the sun, and each of her steps left a deep imprint. Once her calves began to ache, Draco's shape shifted into a camel. Celine jumped onto his back and struggled to balance herself. Once she felt more comfortable, she began to sway with Draco, moving with the camel. Red also began to crawl out of Zayden's shadow and remained in his smaller form. He stretched his wings and perched itself onto his master's shoulder. The four of them continued to climb through each hill and chat leisurely. Chapter 37. Celine. A young, squeaky voice surprised Celine and Zayden. They turned around in unison, scaring a group of small children who were startled from their intimidating aura. Celine gaped at the small, curly-haired boy in front of her. "Oren? Why are you here?" Next to her, Zayden was also dumbfounded by this sudden intrusion. There is a temple not far from here. Mother often comes here to pray and sometimes brings me along to play with these kids." "Oren, this stranger is not your sister. She doesn't look like us." One boy pulled Oren away from Celine, who had just climbed down from Draco's back. "Yeah, don't tell them anything. They look suspicious." One little girl narrowed her eyes, glaring at Celine suspiciously. "Stop it. She's my sister, right?" Celine, his voice sounded less confident, although his honey-colored eyes seemed to glisten in expectation. "Yes, that's right. I am Oren's older sister." She wanted to reach out and squeeze his chubby cheeks, along with the other children. Celine was currently overwhelmed by the amount of adorable faces that she smiled without even realizing it. "Liar. Then why would you come to this abandoned desert?" The little girl was the tallest out of the 6 children who hovered behind her. She seemed to be especially protective over Oren, who struggled in her grasp. "The children seem to think we are imposters. Zayden. I guess we have no choice but to convince them." Her smile sent shivers down the children's back as she began to unravel the cloth around her face. Wow, children are so easy to please. Celine had easily won the children over by using Draco's shape-shifting advantage. Draco had transformed into a beautiful white tiger, and each child had taken turns riding on his back. Zayden helped lift the child onto the tiger's back, earning the nickname of Strong Older Brother. He seemed to like that nickname and smiled. Celine had also introduced the freeze tag game, which the children loved. They began to adore Celine and Zayden, immediately opening up to them and never wanting the day to end. Although Zayden and Celine did not get to train their familiars, they created sweet memories with Oren and his friends. When the sun finally began to set, they could hear Oren's mother calling for the children. Draco disappeared into Celine's shadows, and disappointment spread across each of the children's faces. "We want to spend more time with you," the boys wailed. "Please come back." Older sister tears were threatening to overflow Oren's eyes. He was reluctant to part with Celine, and his whining grew louder. She had also grown fond of her little brother, giving him a gentle hug. "I'll definitely come back, Oren, but you must keep this day a secret. The same goes for each and every one of you. If you tell anyone what happened, I will never visit this desert again. Do you understand?" Her warning was stern, and she narrowed her eyes. The children nodded in unison, startled by her change in attitude. Meanwhile, the little girl had clung to Zayden's back, completely infatuated by him. She whispered, "Older brother, come back and marry me in the future." She giggled and tightly wrapped her arms around Zayden's neck. The second prince briefly glanced at Celine and whispered into the little girl's ear. Whatever he had said upset her greatly, and she began to pout, shooting daggers at Celine with her eyes. She burst into tears as if she had received great injustice, then pushed Zayden away. The little girl ran away, heading back to the temple. "Wait for us," the boys chased after the little girl. "I'll see you later." Older sister Oren looked back and waved one last time, hopping like a rabbit before joining the crowd. She tilted her head while observing Zayden, wondering how he could possibly make the little girl cry. Instead of asking, they moved quietly, too exhausted to start a conversation. Dealing with the children had taken away most of Celine's energy. Even Zayden seemed slightly drained. Draco carried both of them back in his camel form. Because Celine was slightly taller than Zayden, she sat behind him. Her body became more heavy, and she struggled to sit upright. Without giving a second thought, she rested her head on Zayden's shoulder blade. He stiffened at once, which was better for Celine since she didn't need to lower her head down as much. Celine was too tired to see Zayden's reddened ears as she wrapped her arms around his thin waist for support. These motions came naturally to her, especially since the two had grown up together. "Remember when I taught you how to play freeze tag for the first time?" she murmured. "You were extremely excited and happy at that time. It would have been much more fun if there were more kids playing with us like today." Her voice sounded clear underneath the moonlight. The desert was silent and calm at night. Zayden could only look up at the stars to distract himself from the warm breath against his back. His body became increasingly tense, and the stars seemed to be especially brighter that night. "No, it's bright all around me," he thought in amazement. He felt as if he was walking through the cluster of stars in the sky, as if the world was unfolding around him. The joy in his heart couldn't be contained, and he wanted to be her pillar forever. "Ah, what do I do? I must like you too much." Celine was completely unaware of his emotions and continued to reminisce their memories together, not minding his lack of response. "I felt like I was a child again," Zayden finally replied. "Me too. Now that I think about it, we've been through a lot over the years." Celine chuckled and closed her eyes. She breathed in his scent and relaxed. "Thank you for being by my side. In this world, I only have you." Draco huffed and aimlessly spit onto the floor, as if he was wronged. She smiled even greater, releasing a louder laugh. "You too, Draco. I only have you and Zayden." Chapter 38. "I saw you, and the generous joy flowed upon me from your sweet glance. My heart was wholly at your side, and every breath I drew was for you. Rosy spring sunshine surrounded your delightful face and tenderness for me." A young scholar stood underneath an altar, reciting a Western poem for the crowd of noblemen and women. The noblewomen swooned over his delicate features, moved by his tender words. The lyrics permeated into their hearts, dazed by the beautiful words flowing out of his mouth. Lady Yasna gazed meaningfully at Sir Vigos, unable to contain the sweetness in her eyes. Many women stole glances at Prince Laith with flushed cheeks. Xavier especially smiled softly in his direction. Celine could only watch with ridicule in her eyes, giving Zayden a sidelong glance before they sneered in unison. This was the first gathering Celine had attended since her reputation had fallen. She was curious to hear the well-known poems of this time period, and was dismayed to see a group of fangirls drooling over the young scholars. The scene before her was rather embarrassing to watch. However, in the depths of her soul, Celine was greatly disheartened. The thought of love was extremely complicated for her. "Once I leave this empire and begin anew, will I be able to find love again?" Celine believed that she was most likely destined to wander the world alone with Draco for the rest of her life. She wasn't disappointed by this idea, yet she felt a wave of loneliness washing over her. She found herself looking at Prince Zayden, and chuckled to herself. "If I can't find someone, I don't think Zayden will be able to find anyone either. We'll both be lonely." At that precise moment, Celine widened her eyes as if she had a shocking rumination that shook her to the core. She avoided his questioning gaze, disturbed by her presentiment. "I'm telling you that she covets the second prince too. Didn't you see her gaze soften towards him? She is the crown prince's fiancée. She holds such a prestigious title of the empire, yet she dares to bewitch the second prince." Xavier stood in the midst of the gossip, wiping the tears from her cheeks. "It really is too much," she whispered silently. Celine's lips twitched in annoyance. She had been returning from the desert after spending the day with Oren and Zayden, clearly exhausted from the long journey. To her disgust, Xavier and her supporters were gathered near the end of the Crystal Hall, slandering Celine's name. Celine had endured countless insults throughout the years and had managed to ignore every one of Xavier's jabs. Nonetheless, she was particularly impatient that night. In truth, hearing someone insult her name was never a pleasant feeling. Why do I have to hear this right now? Draco seemed to understand her sentiments and slowly climbed out of her shadows, ready to scare the flashy women on his master's demand. Celine didn't want to call for Draco since she didn't want to insult the crown prince's concubine. The society would interpret Celine's actions as an act of jealousy, and she did not want to be labeled as that kind of woman. Since Prince Leith resided within the Crystal Hall, he could clearly hear Xavier's idle chatter. He had left his chambers to clear Celine's name, when a sharp pain pierced the right side of his head. Leith Xavier noticed the prince immediately, and the crowd gravitated towards him. He masked the discomfort and nodded politely with a slight grimace. Then, the prince noticed Celine in the corner of his eyes, and his desire to reprimand the women increased. He hoped that she would appreciate his goodwill and see him in a more favorable light. Xavier placed a hand on his arm, and the pain seemed to spread instantly. He struggled to think properly, vigorously massaging his forehead. Your Highness. Xavier frowned as she sensed his stiffness, clasping his arms with a tighter grip. Perhaps you aren't feeling well. Why don't you retire to your chambers for tonight? Her sweet, coaxing voice made her supporters blush in surprise by the daring words. Yes, it is time to leave now. We will see you tomorrow. Xavier. The supporters lowered their heads and soon dispersed, fully aware of the couple's intentions. By the time Prince Leith had fully recovered his senses and cleared his headache, it was much too late. Celine had slipped away, and he had failed to mend their relationship once again. Should I catch up to her and explain why I didn't defend her? His gaze lingered on an empty spot, where that woman had previously stood just minutes ago. He shook his head and smiled bitterly. I am a pathetic fool. My presence will only bother her. Prince Leith lowered his head despondently as Xavier supported him into the dark chambers. Chapter 39. Celine watched as Prince Leith struggled to speak amongst the superficial woman flanking his side. She saw that he had noticed her, and became disgusted by his awful timing. His face had brightened when they locked eyes for a split second. She grunted inwardly, for she hated giving him any sort of satisfaction or attention. I look like the other woman right now, Celine lamented. Thankfully, Hala had tugged her arm in an attempt to pull her away from the scene. When she met Hala's anxious eyes, Celine's mood worsened. Hala was usually never nervous, unless the matter was related to the Emperor or Sir Villiga. Considering how it was late in the evening, Celine deducted that the Emperor had sent for her again. Back then, Celine was exceedingly anxious, especially since she was facing an Emperor. After she became a victim to his assault, the Emperor became a constant reminder of the harsh reality she lived in. She would remember that she was living in a world without advanced technology, a world where women weren't respected and democracy didn't exist. Upon realizing how she would never return to her comfortable, previous life, Celine felt an overwhelming feeling of anguish. She was crushed by the grim reality she faced and constantly lived in fear. However, Draco had returned to her side, offering Celine warmth and protection. She felt secured with the reassuring fact that her familiar would continue to defend her. Her attitude had become more optimistic, and she didn't feel the need to overthink trivial matters as much. Her nervousness was replaced with the feeling of excitement. Celine's breathing was slightly abnormal, and her hands seemed to sweat profusely. A strange sense of haziness clouded her vision, yet her surroundings was clearer than ever. Hala. Celine sounded breathless, walking as if she was in a daze. Hala was alarmed. She expected her master to melt down, yet she couldn't find a trace of panic in Celine. Tonight might be the start of a new reign, Celine chuckled historically. My lady. You cannot say that, Hala gasped, startled by the traitorous words. They had already reached the Emperor's private quarters, where Hala was forbidden from entering. Emperor Michaelis had deliberately driven out every servant, stationing guards outside of his chambers to ensure nobody interrupted him again. The guards urged for Celine to proceed, blocking Hala from following in. Celine faced her servant once more. "Don't call for the second prince," she issued a warning and nonchalantly walked in. As soon as her master was engulfed into the darkness of the room, Hala ran for the second prince's residence. She ran as if her life depended on it, for she recalled Celine's expression after she had defeated her father. It had been similar to the expression she wore moments before entering the emperor's chamber. Her multicolored eyes gleamed fiercely, and luminous figure appeared lethal, almost as if she had become inhumane. Hala was afraid that Celine would truly commit a terrible deed and become evil. Zayden was reading a text on the windowsill when she barged into Prince Zayden's small room and skipped the formal greetings. He immediately snapped the book shut as he frowned upon Hala's intrusion. He wanted to comment on Hala's impoliteness towards a royal family member, yet she interrupted him again. "The emperor has called for Celine again. She entered his chambers just now." Hala burst into tears. She hiccuped and shivered in fear as she saw Zayden's reaction. The tense air suffocated her, and she lowered her head with widened eyes. Please help. Lady Celine." Prince Zayden wore a murderous expression that was more frightening than her master's. She seemed to be conscious of her mistake and knelt to the floor. Even though she had watched the second prince since he was a child, she was scared of him for the first time. Hala gulped. The emperor wore loose garments that barely covered his wide figure. He was already drunk, face as flushed as an apple. He sat on a luxurious couch, holding a bottle of liquor while his guest forward. Celine bowed. "I greet your highness Emperor Michaelis I of the Great Zayden Empire. I have been waiting for you." He motioned her to step closer and slapped the seat next to him. "Why don't you sit next to the emperor?" For Emperor Michaelis, he didn't feel the need to rush, especially since his perception of time had decreased due to his drunken state. His movements were slower as his grin widened at Celine's appearance. He waited until Celine finally seated herself next to him. She still seemed to shine inside the dimly lit chambers, glimmering like a mythical creature. "Why did your majesty call for me?" she asked softly. The emperor was too captivated by her dark lips to notice the dangerous glint in her eyes. "I hear that my son has refused to bed you. You are a special woman. That coward doesn't know how to use a good woman when he sees one." He spoke slowly, dragging out each word as if it was difficult to pronounce. "I was surprised when Laith requested a concubine. He had returned to the empire just for you. Was the reunion so awful that he needed another woman?" He laughed at his own words and nearly fell back. The crown prince Celine tilted her head. "He never came to visit me. I believe you are mistaken, your majesty." "You dare say that I'm mistaken?" He attempted to raise his voice, and his words came out as slurs. "Forgive me, your grace. I have made a grave mistake. I do recall meeting him." Now she lied. Celine was momentarily distracted by the sudden news. She recalled how Prince Zayden had believed he saw the crown prince when they visited the night bazaar. Had he truly seen the crown prince that night? Did he misunderstand their relationship and believe she was unfaithful? That explains why the crown prince treated me coldly. He believed I was a cheater and his conservative self couldn't handle the jab to his pride. He truly misunderstood all by himself. Celine restrained from rolling her eyes. She still couldn't understand the crown prince. Why did he care? Didn't he love Xavier? "Come closer so that I can admire my son's woman." She glanced at the emperor's wicked smile, as if this title of hers entertained him greatly. Celine closed the distance and leaned closer. Her lack of hesitance surprised the emperor since she usually avoided him. "Have you become a loose woman? I knew I should have taken you as my concubine instead," he commented. General Vil. "I'm sure you already know that you have no blood relations to my closest companion." He reached out and stroked her chin, allowing her to sit next to his side. Surely he wouldn't dare reject my proposal. He roughly pulled her onto his lap and paused, as if he needed to recover his strength. The alcohol had thoroughly scattered his mind. "Your Majesty is the Emperor of the Zionites, the sovereign ruler of our empire," she murmured. Her hands momentarily trembled, and she managed to hide her excitement by stroking his crisp hair. The smell of alcohol filled her nose, yet Celine grinned seductively and ignored the stench. Emperor Michaelis widened his sinister smile, pleased by her gentle tone. His eyes drifted towards her chest, wanting to knead the beautiful breasts hidden underneath the satin gown. The pillar of our country, a symbol representing the people and promising everlasting protection, Celine continued, and Emperor Michaelis didn't seem to mind. He was focused on undressing her. His aggressive motions tore the soft fabric immediately. But would anyone really miss you, she questioned. Celine's words were drowned by the ripping sounds of her torn dress. The Emperor wasn't able to hear her last sentence. She was nearly naked, wearing nothing but her undergarment. The cold air brushed against her bare skin, and she shivered. This gesture seemed to entice the drunk man. Before he could even touch her, Celine stepped away from his reach. "Your Majesty, you must see my familiar. May I show him to you?" That fish, the Emperor frowned, wondering why she would mention her familiar. He was frustrated by the distance between them, yet he couldn't steady himself. His movements were especially slow due to his intoxicated body. Yes, the Emperor was lost in her alluring appearance, failing to notice Celine's shadow contorting into a terrifying shape. He wanted to admire the woman's shape before ravishing her. Meanwhile, Celine waited for him to reach out, itching to wipe the smile off his face. Unfortunately, as soon as her shadow finally revealed itself, the Crown Prince burst through the heavily guarded doors. "Father," he yelled angrily, then froze in his tracks. Chapter 40. Emperor Michaelis finally looked away from Celine and met the eyes of a terrifying monster. He began to tremble and scream, jumping away from the couch. The shock overwhelmed his senses and he fainted, falling back onto the couch with a thud. Prince Zayden pushed past his brother and rushed to Celine. He retrieved the torn gown and wrapped the remaining fabric around her shoulders before tightly embracing her. He pulled her in for a longer hug, and when he finally released her, the warmth still lingered. She stared blankly as Zayden fussed over her, examining her body for any injuries. "Did you think this was a good idea?" Once he had ensured there were no physical injuries on Celine, he became angry. His voice prevailed, a heavier tone filled with deep emotions. The apple of his cheeks reddened as he took in her disheveled appearance. "Do you have no respect for yourself? What were you even thinking? Did Hala tell you?" Celine ignored his probing questions. His entire face became inflamed with dismay. "That's not the problem here. What were you going to do just now? How can you willingly return here again after that night?" Pain swirled in his gold irises, and Celine was confused by his frustration. "Nothing was going to happen. I have Draco," she drew her words slowly. "Still, you could have handled the situation differently. You should have called for me," he whispered. He closed his eyes and grimaced. Prince Zayden didn't want to imagine what would have happened if he had been too late. "What if he touched you?" Celine cupped his red cheeks, forcing him to face her. The two stared into each other's eyes, paying no attention to their surroundings. "I'm completely fine, okay? He can never do anything to me." She made sure to smile in order to reassure him. "Then why is your dress ripped apart?" "It would be suspicious if I came out of his chambers untouched." She shrugged and avoided Zayden's scrutinizing stare, realizing how close they had been. She stepped away and called for her familiar. Draco. Draco, who had been cornering Prince Laith, spun around and shrunk in size. He disappeared into Celine's shadow. Or coy. It was a hideous beast. Just now he was dazed by the sudden situation. Adding to the fact that his father had been assaulting Celine during his absence, he had also discovered how powerful her familiar was. "He's not hideous. He's my familiar." She fastened her gaze on Draco with admiration. Then she sharpened her eyes towards the Crown Prince. "I would appreciate it if your highness could keep the happenings of this night a secret between us. When His Majesty wakes up, he will most likely believe that he was delusional due to his drunken state. Because he believes he passed out, he probably won't have any recollection of my visit either." "Has my father always been like this?" Prince Laith's voice was small, and his marvelous figure seemed to be shaking. He was distraught by his father's actions again, and Celine felt pity for him. "How many times must I see your pitiful form?" Celine sighed heavily. "This is only the second time, so your highness doesn't need to look at me with those guilty eyes. You're not responsible for your father's sins. Although it would be nice if he stopped calling for me. If you're truly guilty, then do something about it. Aren't you my fiancé? Don't you have the power to stop the Emperor? If not, when His Majesty calls for me again, I'll take matters into my own hands." She wanted to kick the Emperor's unconscious body before she left, but thought it was not worth wasting her energy. Instead, Celine signaled for Zayden to escort her out of the room. She leaned into Zayden for support, who frowned as he noticed her body trembling faintly. He suppressed his anger for now and glared at his father in disdain, until Celine had to pull him towards the door. "Let's go," she whispered. Meanwhile, Prince Leith watched the two leave again. He felt as if he was experiencing déjà vu. He stood at the foot of the door for a while, watching the pathetic father of his. He realized how Celine was practically a stranger to him. When had her familiar become stronger? How did she grow closer with the second prince? What had happened to her during the times they were apart? Prince Leith's mind was filled with endless questions, yet he would never be able to receive answers. He was filled with bitter, for it seemed as if he constantly missed the timing. Celine and Prince Leith grew more distant, yet they had never been close from the start. Would Celine ever understand his feelings? "I've never seen the second prince look this scary before. I was truly scared and even shivering to my bones. I became convinced that someone was going to die tonight." Hala shook her head as she recalled Zayden's murderous reaction. "He's only 14 years old. He shouldn't have had to witness his father's twisted actions." "Young? He's old enough to be married," Hala exclaimed. If Prince Leith had never left, Lady Celine would have probably had many children by now. Celine refused to speak any further and stood silently as Hala fixed her into a new nightgown. She felt relaxed after cleansing herself with lukewarm water. The meeting with the Emperor was a distant memory for her, almost like a fever dream. Truthfully, Celine was scared to harm the Emperor. There could have been dangerous consequences if she was caught, and Celine had truly acted on impulse. She hadn't thoroughly planned or known what she would do to the Emperor. Celine only wanted to teach him a lesson for bothering her all those years. She figured that Hala was going to disobey her order and inform Zayden immediately. She hadn't expected him to arrive that early and even see her undressed. Celine was simultaneously disappointed and relieved by the prince's sudden arrival. She had finally realized how reckless she was, and the need for vengeance had dissipated. That night, Draco took Celine and the second prince to their usual spot at the top of the dome. Zayden was visibly upset, although he glanced at her occasionally. The silence was heavy, and she felt rather awkward and nervous for the first time. "Don't be mad, Zayden," she attacked him with a hug and yelped when they nearly fell off balance. The two froze and steadied themselves again, all while Celine continued to cling onto his neck. It was difficult for Prince Zayden to pull away since she was taller, so he sat still as she apologized. "I wasn't in the right mindset. I promise I won't do it again, okay?" "I'm not mad at you." He avoided her gaze and looked down instead. "I know you well. You wouldn't place yourself in a dangerous situation twice. You're also much stronger now than you were in the past." Celine blinked. "That's right. Then what made you so upset?" "As soon as Hala told me, I rushed to the Emperor's chambers. The Emperor had forbidden anyone from entering, and I also hesitated. I knew I could easily defeat the guards, yet I hesitated out of my own selfish reasonings. I didn't want the world to discover my familiar, and I was scared something terrible would go wrong. I had to forcibly drag the crown prince out of his chambers." Zayden felt extremely weak for begging someone else to save her. He resented himself for his cowardice. His expression revealed no trace of despondency, yet his nails were digging into his palms. "You did the right thing. This empire should never know that your familiar is a dragon. The world will only use you to their advantage, or they will kill you if they believe you are a threat. Especially if you attack the soldiers, it would show that you're an uncontrollable enemy." Celine's heart was deeply moved by his constant support and wanted to try her best to relieve his anger. He hadn't acted rashly nor killed the innocent guards. This further proved that Zayden would never be a villain in this life, and that their fateful end would change. She wished for Zayden to stray further from violence and live peacefully for the rest of his life. "I taught you that violence is never the answer, and that your familiar must be a secret from the world. Today I made a mistake and wasn't able to control my anger. You did well." Celine leaned onto his shoulder. She realized that he was growing taller since she didn't need to crouch as much. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm sorry that I'm not powerful enough to keep you from harm." Zayden's eyes were filled with sadness. You only need to stay by my side. Celine smiled warmly. She tightened her grip and buried her head onto his shoulder. I will stay by your side. I will grow stronger so that no one can touch you. Not even the Emperor, he whispered. Celine lifted her head and pulled away. She was surprised by his sudden declaration. That's too much. You're only a child. I'm not a child, he cut her off coldly, and his usual self seemed to be returning. Fine, you are a teen then. But so are you. There's a difference between 14 and 16-year-olds. For now, let me protect you, Celine whispered.